Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from the coffee break. Welcome to the sort of the closing part, I guess, of this year's UX Lisbon. Very happy to be here. My name is Steve Baty. I am a founder and principal of a design studio based in Sydney, Australia. If you sort of stick a pin through the globe from Sydney through the core of the Earth, it comes out just to the southwest of here. So we're almost on the exact opposite side of the planet from you. It's a nice flight. It's lovely to be here. And I want to begin by, I guess, just touching on a couple of things that have been said today before I get into sort of the real sort of structure and meat of my own talk. I just want to say a couple of things about some of the things we've heard. You've heard from a number of sort of very experienced, very good design practitioners. Mike talked with extreme passion about our ability as designers to both screw things up, but also to do great things. Kate spoke eloquently about how we need to understand users, understand people, understand their needs and their goals, understand the use to which they might like your product or service to be put. Russ talked about leadership and some of the lessons he's learned along the way, and what none of them yet sort of spoke about, and that's why I thought I'd sort of pause for a moment to say so, is that it's all very hard. It takes years to get there. It is frustrating along the way. It is a challenge to stand up to corporate authority and to your bosses and to senior managers. It is hard. And over the course of your careers, you will face situations where you are tired, where you are fatigued, where you really do want to just sort of get through the next sort of few days. Mike made the point, we sort of, we reached that stage, it's just like, okay, I'm over this, just let it out. And whether it's learning to be a better designer, whether it's making ethical choices, whether it's sort of going to the effort of really trying to understand someone and their needs and design something that's significant to them, it's hard and it takes effort. It takes an effort of will, it takes intellectual effort. We need to train for that in the same way that we train to run a marathon. It doesn't come just because you hear somebody talk about it. When you go out of here and try it for the first time come Monday, you will find it hard. Stick with it. It's worth it. There are millions of people out there who will benefit as a result of that effort on your part and that perseverance on your part. Literally millions of people in this country, back home in Australia, right across the world. The work that we do really does have a real impact, for good or worse. But you won't get there. You won't deliver the good results and the positive results. You won't do it in a good way if you don't persevere, if you don't try. And it will be hard. But stick with it, because the rewards when you do a good piece of work and you see the benefit, when you can walk into the Department of Motor Vehicles in the USA and find that there's music and friendly people, and they have this sort of service attitude that says, how can I help you now? Instead of next, we'll find that the world will be a better place for all of us. One of the things about Meld Studios is that we exist to help people interact with the world in their everyday lives. We exist to make that better. We use design to do that. Right, that's enough. That's a lecture or something. What I am going to talk about for the other sort of 26 minutes or so of this little talk is something that Jess touched on in his talk, that sort of highest order part of the design work that we do, which is how we frame problems. It is the sort of culmination of our sense-making work when we are going through the process of understanding the research that we've done, of understanding people, of really getting to the bottom of their needs. We reach a point where we sort of ask that question of, well, what problem are we really trying to solve? And the way in which we phrase that has an enormous impact and essentially shapes the rest of our work. If we get that wrong, if we are timid about this part of it, if we are a little weak and a little tired at this point in time, then the rest of the work will also be fairly timid and weak. It's very hard to recover from poor or superficial framing of a problem. I recently had the opportunity to hear Ezio Manzini speak. If you're not familiar with him, he is a brilliant professor of design in Milan, and he highlighted this issue as both the most critical part. Our sense-making ability and our ability to frame a problem is one of the most critical and powerful parts of the design process and the design methods. And he also said it's the bit we are the weakest at. It's the bit we practice the least. It's the bit that we work on the least. We focus much more on the craft of design, on the technique of design, and we don't pay enough attention to this part of it, which is making sense of what we see in the world around us and framing a problem in a way that really allows us to do something special with it. For me, framing a problem has three key roles. The first is that it simply allows you to identify and articulate new ways of thinking about an issue. And I'll go through examples of this, so I won't sort of dwell on this too much. The second, Kate talked about this in her talk, where she said, you know, we understand users, we understand their needs and their goals. That allows us to identify uses. That then sort of, from that we derive features, and from that we derive sort of some sense of a product in some kind of coherent formulation. And the bit in the middle is that we sort of forget that there is more than one way to describe our users. There is more than one way to describe their needs. We have different frames of reference. The way in which the police force refers to a perp is different to the way, say, someone who works in social justice might refer to someone who's been arrested. We do some work in the justice system in my home state of New South Wales. And one of the challenges that we've been facing is working with very different groups in the justice cluster: correctional services, juvenile justice, remand centres, police, public prosecutors, public defenders, and the courts themselves. And the way in which each of those view the same person is very, very different. Their frame of reference is very, very different. And so the way they interpret the data, the way they interpret the behavior of individuals ends up being very, very different. There is not one frame of reference, and we need to be deliberate about the way in which we think about those things. Part of the design process is to explore those different frames and see where it gets us. The last one is that the way in which we frame a question, the way in which we frame a problem, sends a clear message about our ambition for the project. We can talk about eradication, we can talk about elimination, we can talk about reduction and improvement. And those different framings send a very, very different message about what's expected and what's accepted by the people sponsoring our projects. I'll get into a few examples of what that looks like. We are seeing a strong shift in design away from products towards services, towards experiences. We are looking at a shift towards a focus on purpose, not product, a focus on intent, not object. This is a quote by Theodore Levitt, and it strikes home quite clearly that when someone buys, in this case, when someone buys a drill, when someone buys a drill bit, they're not after a drill bit. What they're trying to do is make a hole of a particular size. If you define yourself in terms of the drill bit, then you are forever sort of stuck into this mindset of making better and better drill bits. Whereas if you focus on what the person wants, which is a hole, then the way in which you achieve that might be very, very different. It opens up a whole range of opportunity for you. Now, we recently, as I said, we're doing some work with the Justice Department in New South Wales, and they came to us with the idea that we needed to improve a piece of technology. And the question that we asked was, well, why? Why improve it? What's the intent of that change? Why make it any better at all? And it turns out that in the state of New South Wales, there are a few things that happen when you get arrested, all of which are out of your control. and none of which anyone really cares about other than you as the person who was arrested. But for example, in New South Wales, if the police walked in and arrested me now, I could spend anything up to about 72 hours being moved around our prison system before I saw a magistrate. A magistrate is the only person who is permitted by law to release me back out into the community on bail. So until I see a judge, I'm basically a criminal. I'm not guilty yet, remember, I've only been arrested and charged. But it can be up to 72 hours I can get moved around the justice system. In over half of all cases, it's something like 65% of all cases, when I do appear in front of a judge, in front of a magistrate, they will release me on bail back out into the community without any additional information than what the arresting officer had. So no new information, but in the meantime, I've been locked up in jail. I'm away from my family, I'm away from lawyers. I'm not getting any help, and no one really knows where I am. But this was framed as a technology thing, and what we ended up doing was changing the way that they viewed that part of the justice system and how they sort of think about, with a lower J, justice in that situation. We focused on the purpose, not the product. Another way that you can reframe things is to broaden the scope of your inquiry. Rather than focusing narrowly, you focus more broadly. Margot used the example of the Chevrolet ride at Disney. It's a fun thing. They chose not to focus on the ride. They chose to focus on the whole experience of the ride and the experience around it, and they focused on waiting the queue. And queues are a funny thing. If we are engaged, we don't really think of ourselves as waiting. We're not wasting time. Queues are a problem when we are actually stuck in them and we're unengaged. When we are engaged, we don't care. There was an airline and an airport in the US a few years ago that was getting, their number one complaint was how long it took to get bags off the carousel. I travel a lot. This story is a little close to my heart. That's why I use carry-on almost always and never check luggage. And what they found was that people always complained about how long they stood there and waited for their luggage to come through the carousel. And if you've ever sort of been through that process, you'll find that it is actually, at the end of a flight, you sort of stand there and it's like, I just want to go and get to a hotel and have a shower. I don't want to stand here and wait for the thing. And for the longest time, it's empty anyway, right? It's just... And what this airline and what the sort of the terminal tried to do was cut down the amount of time it took to get bags from the plane onto the baggage carousel and back to the customer. And they really worked hard at it. And they got it down from 15 minutes on average down to 10 minutes. And it was still the number one complaint from passengers. And then they tried something else. They started putting planes in the gates and redesigned the airport so that you were further away from the baggage carousel when you got off. And you walked through the airport for like 9 minutes. And that's fine, because that's outside the airport's control. It's outside the airline's control. It's just sort of where you ended up. And no one sort of really put those two things together. But what they found was that suddenly they were only waiting for their bags for 1 minute. They would just appear in like magic. Because they were engaged. It's okay. I don't know whether you've been on a long flight recently, but I can tell you that walking is lovely when you've been sitting on a plane. It took me 27 hours to get here, and I can tell you, I took the stairs, I walked, not used the escalators, I took a stroll. I was happy to walk because my knees were locked into this kind of position after 27 hours. It's no fun. So it was fine. You walk through the airport, and suddenly, just like magic, these things appear. This story is in 1956, Malcolm McLean, who was a trucking magnate, became frustrated with the length of time that it took to offload cargo from ships onto his cars, like onto his trucks. And he came up with the idea in that sort of peak of frustration. Instead of focusing on the stevedoring operation on the ship, he thought more about, well, how can I get this onto my truck faster? And came up with the idea of the steel container shipping, like shipping containers. The whole thing just comes up and goes down. And it transformed international shipping. When you read about it, you'll find that the introduction of the shipping container into sort of global freight distribution systems has made it possible for the developing countries of Asia to become the manufacturing plants of the Western world. In the absence of that kind of shipping, it just wouldn't happen. But you need to frame the problem in a broader way, and this is a good way to do it. Another nice example of this is the electric kettle. For years, electric kettles had a plug coming out of them, and the plug sort of plugged into the wall, and you could only ever sort of pour it within about 2 feet of the wall socket. That was it. Otherwise, you had to unplug it and sort of take the whole thing with you to pour hot water to make a cup of tea or an instant coffee. And for years, like all of the sort of white good manufacturers thought about that problem in the same way, which was, well, how do we make it boil faster so that people could get on with the process of making their tea? And someone thought, well, if I actually think about the whole activity, the activity is to actually get water and make a cup of tea. So if I made it easier and separated those two things and had an electric base and then a pot, I could actually make that much more convenient. And people love that, and that's sort of become the norm for electric kettles as a result. But we go through this process of broadening the scope of our inquiry and thinking about an activity rather than a task. And we frame the problem in terms of, well, how do we make that activity better? This is a really nice example of a different way of thinking about it. This is a GE MRI machine. And like a lot of technology, MRI machines focused only on imaging quality. Clear image, clear image, clear image. Got to get a clearer image. And sometimes it was maybe do it a little bit faster. The problem is kids are horrified of these machines. They find them claustrophobic, they're noisy. If you've had an MRI, they're like a really, really noisy sort of hot tub for 20 minutes or so. And to get a good image, you need to be very, very still. Anyone have children under 4 years of age? They don't sit still when they're upset. There's not a hope in hell. And what was happening was parents were having to try and hold their children down. This is something else that's fun if you've got a young child, sort of holding them still while someone jabs them with a needle or does something that clearly distresses them. There's a joy that just doesn't come with that. What GE did was rather than think about the function, they thought about, well, we need to get a clearer image. And for that to happen, we need the child to be still. And rather than restraining them in more effective ways, why don't we look at ways that they might see this in a way that's no longer terrifying? And they came up with these storytelling concepts. And there are a range of them. They don't all look like this. This is a pirate one. But they started sort of looking at the experience of having an MRI and changed the frame of the design problem. The underlying technology stayed the same, but instead they changed the experience around it in a way that children found engaging. Part of the story was that you had to stay very still. And they did. Willingly. And suddenly the quality of the scans and the quality of the overall experience and ultimately the actual quality of the health outcome for the child became much, much better as a result. Instead of focusing on function, they focused on that experience. And by doing that, as I say, they changed their frame of reference. They changed the way they were thinking about and tackling the problem. Another one is to use those extremes. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation exists to do a range of things. One of the problems that they are tackling is malaria. Now, you can frame a problem like malaria in terms of, reduce the incidence of malaria. You might improve the life expectancy or improve the quality of life of someone with. No. The way they've framed this is essentially a world without malaria. This is there's no qualification to that statement. What they aim for is a world without malaria. And in terms of the design problem, that becomes less about, we don't want this or we don't want, maybe we can make a 2% increment. This is a 100% eradication of a problem. This is the sort of thing that saw the end of polio, although that's now coming back due to reasons that beg a belief. But this sort of thing is a bold way of framing a problem. This is similar to the way in which the moon landing was put. Like in 1960, the American president said, we will put a man on the moon within the next decade. That is a clear, absolute, bold statement. This is the same. We are going to eradicate malaria. And it changes the way we think about the problem, and it sets a clear expectation of the scope of the ambition of our concepts. This is a big, big difference in the way in which we approach our problems. We were given, just let me give you 2 examples from our work. At Meld Studios, we were asked to help a university, and it's a local Australian university, but they have campuses around the world. We were asked to help them improve the experience of being admitted to the university. And we went out and we spoke with students in Vietnam, in Singapore, in their home base in Melbourne. We spoke with staff, people who went through the admissions process, people who sort of assessed applications and assessed candidates, people who conducted interviews and reviewed portfolios and all sorts of things. And what we had been expected to find by the client were a series of pain points around, the way in which the online application works, or needing to send in a physical portfolio. Because, in order to improve the experience of being admitted, we were focusing on successful students. And what we found everywhere was that the absolute worst part of the experience of being admitted to university is being told no. That's the bit that sucks. It's not actually being accepted, because if you are accepted, you're happy and you forget the rest of it. If you're familiar with the peak end rule of service sort of experiences, that's a big up at the end. Happy about that, you're in. For the 70 or 80% of students, and we're talking about tens of thousands of unsuccessful candidates who've had their sort of hopes and dreams just smashed, everybody hates it. And the university is this sort of dull, cold, sort of introverted place on the day in which the acceptance letters go out, because on the same day, so do all the rejections. And everybody hates it, and everybody is subdued. And none of the staff are as excited as they might be. And so we reframed the problem. We restated it as, how might we eliminate rejections? That was our design challenge that we decided to take up. And everything else then started to inform a process by which we helped students match their capability with a university course that had capacity to accept them in a way that set their expectations, and at which they got better at sort of matching over time. Ultimately, the idea or the ambition of the program is that a student who first engages with the university, as they know more about them, they're able to say to them, look, I know you're sort of interested over here, but with your skills and interests and capabilities, you're going to fail. Because one of the other things that we realize is that it's pointless being admitted into a course from which you'll never graduate. If you've sort of paid for a university education, that's a big waste of money. And it's a waste of 1, 2, 3 years of your life. You feel downcast about the fact that you're not succeeding at university in a way that you might. We chose to change the nature of the problem to something that eliminated all of the bad things. By doing so, we're going to improve on some of the things for the people who are admitted. They'll end up with a much better experience as well. But we chose to focus on what might we do to never have to say no to someone. You can be very targeted about those framings. You don't have to use one or the other. This is a photo of the main reading room or workroom of the State Library of Victoria. And it's a beautiful space. If you ever go to Melbourne, go and visit the State Library. It's this beautiful octagonal domed space. It's this big vaulted domed space. When we did work with them, we chose to frame the problem in 2 ways to address the same underlying issue. And the issue was that reference librarians, these people with sort of 30, 40 years of experience with particular materials in this very, very big collection of books, were being asked where the toilets were and what time the library closed, and could they sort of keep a book overnight. All very mundane questions, because the way in which it was organized sort of led to that. Now, we framed the question in 2 separate ways. We said, well, how might we reduce the incidence of those sorts of calls, those sorts of questions? And we ran a set of design activities with staff and with customers, like visitors and ourselves. And we generated a set of concepts that were all very, very incremental. They were the sorts of things that you could walk out of the room and start doing. The following day, we gave a different group of people a different framing of the question, which was how might we make a guest completely self-sufficient within the library? For that one, we chose an absolute. We made something that had no caveats to it. They were just completely self-sufficient. And that leads to all sorts of things. It leads to automatic book retrievals and electronic systems. It means the entire collection might be digitized. It means that the signage is perfect for everyone. Much harder to do, much more ambitious in terms of its scope and its scale. And we generated a whole range of ideas that will take sort of 3 to 5 years to implement. The signage they could fix straight away, but the signage apparently is a running joke within this library. They've had a committee of wayfinding since 1994. And I kid you not, that place is a warren, and it is impossible to find the toilets that are no further away than the back of this room. It's god-awful. So we have made some suggestions, but the key thing is that we used it as a way to generate, quite deliberately, 2 sets of concepts with 2 very different ambitions. One that was very clearly incremental, and one that was much clearly more ambitious. One that could happen straight away, and one that would take years. But we use framing in this kind of way as a way of sort of really shaping the design activity. The way in which business looks to design, the way in which organizations look to design, the way in which people look to design is changing. Their expectations of us is shifting. They expect us, as Jess sort of indicated, they expect us to be less lucky and more deliberate. They expect us to ask big questions. And they expect us to challenge the simple framing of a problem and come back with something that's much more powerful. As Mike was saying, they expect us to say no to them. They expect us to stand up for bad ideas. But our relationship to them is predicated on our ability to deliver, and this is one of the key capabilities that we need. We need to be able to understand problems broadly, and we need to be able to play with the way that we think about them in quite fluid ways. And if we don't, then we're really letting ourselves down. And not only will we let ourselves down, but we'll let our clients down, and probably the saddest of all, we'll let all of those people out there who rely on us. So we need to tackle this. We need to be deliberate about it. We need to really sort of concentrate and put the effort in and think through, is this the best way to tackle this issue? Is this the only way to think about it? No. Is this the best way to think about it? Well, let's work through that. And potentially, let's think about it in multiple different ways so that we can get a set of concepts and a set of possible solutions that we can start to explore and really get the best ones for this problem. That's all from me. Thank you.